So what we're going to do now is shift to this challenge of the modern period of enlightenment and emancipation, because this raises new questions. Once Jews are given the opportunity to become citizens, will they take advantage of it? And what does it mean for their Jewishness? And this is a question Jews themselves asked, as well as Jews, the non-Jewish population around them asked these questions. In fact, in one episode, they actually wrote these questions down and asked for written responses. The French Revolution emancipated the Jews relatively early on through their National Assembly, although there was a heated debate about it, and it actually came in a couple of stages. The Jews of Bordeaux were emancipated somewhat before the Jews of Alsace-Lorraine, and the openness to this new experience within the Jewish community met some resistance from outside the Jewish community because they weren't sure whether the Jews would fully integrate. One of the famous phrases that was used in the debate in the French National Assembly was, to the Jews, everything as individuals, nothing as a nation. That is, they could be individual French citizens and still be Jewish, but to maintain that kind of fully separate identity with language and their own legal system, that simply wouldn't fly. Even so, 15 years after that initial emancipation of the Jews, there were still questions floating in the air. I noticed in the chat window, we have a question because were there communities who chose not to live so separately? And did they feel safer or did they disappear? Well, first of all, they didn't always have the choice, right? Even if they might have wanted to live more integrated, the outside world might not have allowed it. Again, we're thinking of our model today of voluntarily self-segregating communities like the Amish or some ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. That wasn't the case back then. But keep in mind also, most Jewish communities were happy to live in self-segregated experiences because both for safety and for ritual practice. If you have to live walking distance from your synagogue, you don't want to live out in this random suburb. This is pre-cars. And if you feel vulnerable out there, you might not do that either. Plus, don't forget, you're not even allowed to eat at your neighbor's house because they don't keep kosher and you can't eat non-kosher food. So, in a pre-modern time where religion was a primary source of identity, that idea of living parallel but self-segregated could be valuable. Now, there were communities where there were not formal Jewish ghettos. In many parts of the Middle Eastern world, for example, there were not formal Jewish ghettos. You could find Jews living next to non-Jews as well. So they weren't geographically segregated in the same way. But as we'll see when we talk about the community of Salonika, which was a somewhat integrated community geographically, it was still segregated in terms of ritual practice and in terms of self-conception. So even if you might have lived near non-Jewish neighbors, your social circles, your business contacts, your linguistic choices were one of distinct Jewish identity and separate community. Again, there may be exceptions in different times and places, but this was by and large, the general rule. So let's take a look at these questions that Napoleon poses to an assembly he brings together of both rabbis and lay people to ask a series of questions about what does it mean to be Jewish in this new period. This takes place in 1806. And so the first questions he asked are, is it lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife? Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? Is divorce valid if not pronounced by the government's courts? And does it happen in contradiction to French laws? And can a Jewish woman marry a Christian or a Jewish man a Christian woman? Or is the Jewish law they can only marry among themselves? Now, why does Napoleon care about this? Well, it's not that he had his eye on a Jewish woman that he wanted to marry. Remember, the motto of the French Revolution was liberté, égalité, and fraternité, brotherhood. Will you become part of the French nation? And having a community that only marries amongst themselves, maintaining a distinct identity, might be contrary to that concept of brotherhood and this French national identity. And the other question they're asking is, are you going to be like us? Remember, in a Catholic country, or a historically Catholic country, even if post-revolution they tried to be very secular, the idea of only marrying one wife was very important. And will you be like us or will you be weird and foreign? But of course, allowing divorce was also important because that was one of the innovations of the French Revolution, which the Catholic French country did not allow. But when the revolution came in and imposed secularism, they allowed divorce. So they want to know, is divorce allowed? Yes, it should be. But also notice the second question. Is divorce valid if not pronounced by the government's courts? Do you have your own laws, or will you submit to French laws? The next set of questions, if I can get the PowerPoint to work. In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen considered as brothers or strangers? Do the Jews born in France and treated by the law as French citizens consider France to be their country? Will they defend it? Remember, Napoleon's job before he was an emperor, which he maintained, was a general. He wanted soldiers for his army. They were fighting wars all over Europe. And again, that question of fraternity, are you going to consider your nationality as French? What kind of police power do rabbis have? Are there professions Jews are excluded from? And does the law forbid Jews on taking heavy interest on loans to their fellow Jews? And what about to strangers, that is, to non-Jews? So again, you see an echo out of many of these questions of, are you really going to be part of our community, or are you going to be a foreigner who is not integrated and not willing to follow French dominant legal practice? Well, with this opening of enlightenment and most importantly, emancipation, Jews had choices to make of how they wanted to maintain their Jewishness. Now, there were some Jews, by the way, who decided they didn't care about maintaining their Jewishness. Some of them chose to convert and simply join the outside world because of the attractions of the Enlightenment. I'm thinking of people like the poet Heinrich Heine, who described his conversion as his passport to European culture, or the composer Gustav Mahler, who wanted a job as a composer. The only jobs available were in churches, and so he wound up having to convert to be able to be a classical music composer, which he could not do as a Jew in the early 19th century in Germany. So some Jews simply left behind their Jewishness via conversion, or maybe they simply became a cosmopolitan. I'm a universal citizen. I might be a German citizen, but my Jewishness is my past, not my present, and not my future. I don't see any positive connection. I'm just a person, they might have said, or I'm just a German. But there were Jews who wanted to both have citizenship and keep some kind of Jewishness in their identity. And so we'll look at some of those options as we understand what our options are. So first off, we have identifying as a religion. You say, I am a German of the Mosaic faith. I'm an American, but my religion is Judaism. As one Enlightenment poet put it, I'm a man on the street and a Jew in my tent. My Jewishness is a private matter. It's what I believe. It's the ritual practices I follow. The Reform movement, for example, coined the phrase ethical monotheism as a way to define who they were. It was being ethical by Jewish ritual practices and laws, but also believing in one God. Your Jewishness was defined by the prayers and blessings you shared, maybe the dietary laws you followed, and which holidays you observed. And so a peak expression of this was the Pittsburgh Platform of American Reform Judaism, which was issued in 1885, at the end of the 19th century. And you'll notice in many of these, they're trying to frame their Jewishness as primarily or even exclusively a religion. They notice, they claim in the second sentence in the item 1, we hold that Judaism presents the highest conception of the God idea as taught in our scriptures and developed and spiritualized by Jewish teachers. You'll notice, by the way, the Bible is the record of the consecration of the Jewish people to its mission as the priest of the one God. So what does it mean to be chosen? It's chosen for a mission. We are priests to the one. Again, the Jewishness is religion. The Bible is an instrument of religious and moral instruction. You'll also notice, by the way, they are chutzpahdik a little bit in number 2, and they'll say that scientific researches are not antagonistic to our doctrines because the Bible reflects the primitive ideas of its own age. It's a little chutzpahdik. But it is making the claim that being Jewishness is this idea that evolves over time, but is about an idea and belief. Number 3, the Mosaic legislation trained the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. And today, we accept as binding only its moral laws and only maintain the ceremonies that elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject the ones not adapted to modern civilization, specifically diet, priestly purity, and clothing. Those are ideas entirely foreign to our present mental state. They do not further modern spiritual elevation. They actually obstruct it. And then the kicker is number 5. we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. We are not a nation, we are just a religious community. One of the rabbis at this conference, whose name was Isaac Mayer Wise, one of the founding organizers of American Reform Judaism, actually had written a prayer book some 30 years before called Minhag America, the Custom of America, and he actually put the Star-Spangled Banner as one of the optional hymns in the back of the prayer book, because his national identity was American. His Jewishness was purely a religious identity based on beliefs and morals, and not even on ritual practices that they reject as sort of national relics from the national time and living in the land of Israel, and now they are foreign to our mental state. We do not follow them. Notice also in number 5 how they radically redefine Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of not the kingdom of David, but the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. So they've even universalized Jewish messianism, how particular to how universal. Now, there are other people who identify their Jewishness as primarily being part of a family tree of descent, shared ancestry. I mean, certainly with Ancestry.com and 23andMe and so on, a lot of people have found they have Jewish ancestry, but even people who are Jewish are curious to dig into their genetics and find out how much of them is native and how much of them is imported or foreign. I mean, whatever vocabulary you choose to use, it can be complicated. Keep in mind also that within the Jewish community, people would talk about the Jewish race until the Holocaust period. And they would talk about the genius of the Jewish race and the history of the Jewish race, because they saw their Jewishness as a biological identity, not purely as an ethnic identity as we might describe it today, and certainly not purely a religious identity. They felt something about having Jewish blood, about coming from a Jewish background. There are roots to this in, of course, Jewish sources. There were also roots in non-Jewish persecution. During the Inquisition period, there arose an idea called limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood, where they distinguished between new Christians, aka former Jews, and old Christians who had not converted recently. And the new Christians were inherently suspect. So there was a concept that even after conversion, your Jewishness stuck around in some ways. And that's the beginning of a kind of racialized anti-Semitism. But in the 19th century, Jews are living in a European context where ethnic nationalism becomes very popular, where the Serbs want Serbia for the Serbs, and the Ukrainians want to use a Ukrainian language and have Ukrainian national autonomy. And the Lithuanians want to get out from under the heel of the Russian Empire. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is fracturing at the seams because of all the different ethnic groups that are demanding some kind of national self-determination. In fact, one of Woodrow Wilson's major points in the Versailles Treaty process was this concept of national self-determination and allowing different ethnic groups the chance for their own self-identity. And so Jewishness as well falls into this category of looking for an ethnic national identity, even if it could be cultural autonomy and not political. Nevertheless, it was a common thread through the era of the 19th century. On the other hand, there was also a thread during that same period of pure Enlightenment, what I call imperialism, where the idea was you would just be human and your culture didn't matter, your biology didn't matter. This is sort of the push and tug here, where the reformers would say our biology is less important. It's our religious ideas that are what define us. The more ethnic and national Jewish movements, like Zionism or like Yiddish nationalism, might focus on this biology or shared ancestry, or they might also use a more nebulous concept like ethnicity or nationality, where someone might be able to join or be part of more than one nation at a time. This begins to enter modern cultural pluralism ideas. So here's a text from Joseph Chaim Brenner, who was an early Zionist thinker, who wrote about the kind of Jews that they were. We Jews who live everywhere, we are beaten Jews without a country, without a language. The non-Jewish majority does not let us become complete and whole Jews, like our free Russian, Polish friends who are whole Russian and Polish. The environment of the majority confuses us, eats it, dims at our shape. We are far from assimilating. We are not converting. That's a laugh. Our nation, this is getting back to the exile concept. It's sick. We need somewhere else. There's no Messiah to save us. We need strong soldiers who live without a Messiah. We, the living Jews, in the second paragraph, whether we are tormented on Yom Kippur, whether we eat milk and meat, whether we hold the conventions of the Old Testament, or whether we are in the worldview faithful students of Epicurus, that's that Epicurus that we'll talk about in our second half, we do not stop feeling ourselves as Jews. We live our lives as Jews, creating the lifestyle of Jews, speaking a Jewish tongue, receiving our spiritual sustenance from our literature, working for our national free culture, fighting for our national respect, and fighting our war of existence. So for some, the biology was in some ways less important than the lived culture that you had, the language you spoke, the food you ate, the art you created, the clothing you wore, the music you sang, and the holidays and life cycle events you celebrated, but in a secular and cultural way, not necessarily in a primarily religious way. And then finally, there's this concept of peoplehood, as I talked about last night. Peoplehood doesn't necessarily have to be biology, and it can even have a wide range of cultures. For example, people talk all the time about the American people. What does the American people look like? At least as diverse as that picture of what looking Jewish looked like I showed you at the beginning is. But certainly, to be part of the American people can include a wide variety of foods. It can include a wide variety of historical experiences. You could have been here from the Mayflower. You could have just come off a boat and become a citizen. There are all kinds of ways you can be part of that American peoplehood and claim that identity. You know, if I sing about the land of the Pilgrim's Pride or a home on the range, that's part of my American national identity that I am connecting to, even if it's not part of my personal biology. And the same is true for Tex-Mex cooking or Vietnamese pho noodles that are in a fusion restaurant with a Mexican cuisine. And you get this wonderful American hybridization of different national cultures. That's American too. So if you can be part of the American people, the same can be true for Jews, where you claim a connection with peoplehood. I'm part of the Jewish people. I'm part of the Jewish family, we might say. And there are many ways to be part of that family. There are many branches of that family. And so maybe you're adopted into that family. Maybe you marry into that family. Maybe you choose to identify with the family and learn the family history and the family recipes and the family jokes. And then you feel part of the family. Some distant parts of the family might not recognize you as part of the family, while others who are closer to you may be willing to accept you. This is part of family life, and different parts of the family may have very different beliefs about God and the universe and what it means to be part of this family. So that concept of peoplehood or family, I think, is perhaps the most fruitful for us. But in the end, being Jewish is going to be a summary of all these different pieces to different degrees and different priorities. And being Jewish doesn't really neatly fit into any one of these. After all, many Jews do not believe the traditional beliefs or follow the ritual practices that Jewish tradition commands them to do. Most of them do not recite the prayers and blessings they're supposed to say multiple times a day. And so in 2013, when the Pew Forum on Religion in America asked questions about what does it mean to be Jewish, it's not a surprise that a large majority of American Jews said that being Jewish is mainly a matter of ancestry and culture. That's a combination of the biology and the heritage culture question. Only 15% said it was mainly a matter of religion, and 23% combined it all, religion, ancestry, and culture. They felt you couldn't really tease it out. And you'll notice the Jews who identify as non-religious were even more strongly weighted toward thinking of Jewishness as ancestry and culture. The reality is that being Jewish is a cholent. It's a stew of all of the above that's been bubbling for centuries, and different people are going to put in different ingredients and have different balances. But being Jewish is not a simple concept. What is a Jew doesn't have an easy answer. I mean, there are plenty of other challenges that we're grappling with today. The line between being Jewish and being Israeli. After all, 20% of Israel is not of a Jewish background. And some of the Jews who are in that 80% that are identified by the demographers as Jewish aren't recognized as Jewish by another part of that 80%. The ultra-Orthodox not recognizing some people of mixed heritage in the Russian Jewish community or in the Ethiopian Jewish community, as we'll see on Sunday morning. There's also questions raised by having your own country. You know, Yosef Chaim Brenner's Zionism led to a state, But now once you have a state that's defined as a Jewish state, you have to define what a Jew is in legal terms that apply with tax benefits and citizenship benefits. Israel very early on passed a law of return that said anyone who's Jewish can come back. But that begged the question, what counts as being Jewish? And in the 1960s, a priest, a Catholic priest who had been born Jewish and hidden in a monastery during the Holocaust and ultimately baptized as Catholic and became a Catholic priest, his name was Brother Daniel. He applied for Israeli citizenship under the law of return because he said, I was born Jewish. I may be a Catholic priest now, but I was born Jewish, and by the biology definition of Jewishness, I count as a Jew under the law of return. And this proved to be very controversial, as you might imagine, because for some people, having a priest as a Jew seemed like impossible. You root for the Yankees or you root for the Mets, and you root for the Yankees or you root for the Boston Red Sox, to give a more local example, and you can't root for both. You got to pick one. You can't be both. You could be nothing. You could not care about baseball. That's fine. But if you're going to care about baseball, you better pick one or the other. And so the Brother Daniel case highlighted this tension of the ethno-religious identity that had always been there. And in the end, the Israeli Supreme Court came out with a decision that said, you can be Jewish and non-religious, or you can be Jewish and follow the Jewish religion, but you can't be Jewish and follow another foreign religion. And they decided to disqualify him on that grounds. And ultimately, they amended the law of return to try to clarify this definition that Jewishness by biology means your mother is Jewish and you're not part of another religion. But they also would allow people who are refugees to come in if they have just one Jewish grandparent. That one Jewish grandparent is an echo of the Nazi Nuremberg laws. The figuring is if you're being persecuted as a Jew under those categories, you should have the right to flee to the Jewish state as a refuge. But this has gotten even more complicated in the second half of the 20th century because we now have the concept of being Jewish and. If you have people from different heritages getting married and nobody's converting, that means the kids are being raised with multiple heritages, whether they're ethnic, racial identities, or even religious, cultural identities. There's ongoing questions about conversion standards between Reform, Conservative, Orthodox Jews. You might have seen this was in the news recently, where the Israeli Supreme Court, after something like 15 years of waiting, finally decided to declare that Reform and Conservative converts in Israel should be recognized as Jewish. After waiting for the Knesset to pass a legal solution for 15 years, they finally said enough is enough. And so this has been in the news about who recognized a convert here and there. And the reality is, honestly, that most Jews have moved on and accept that being Jewishness is going to be something much more self-directed. So to finish the formal presentation for this half, in 1988, our movement, under the umbrella organization called the International Federation of Secular Humanistic Jews, which is no longer active, but was active for a period of time, issued a statement, again, this is in 1988, on who is a Jew. And they said that this is a very high stakes issue because there are millions of Jews who do not identify with Jewishness as a religion. Their Jewishness is the historic experience of the Jewish people. So that's, again, religion only, that doesn't work. At stake also is the identity of thousands of people who want to be Jewish, but are rejected by the narrow legalism of traditional religious authorities. And so we, on our part, welcome into the Jewish people all people who sincerely desire to share the Jewish experience regardless of ancestry. And we challenge the assumption that Jews are primarily or exclusively a religious community, and that religious convictions or behavior are essential to full membership in the Jewish people. That is, we can read Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith and strike 0 for 13. We can read Mishnah Sanhedrin and we can check all the things they said not to do. We can read the outside books. We can pronounce the name of God. We can not believe the Torah is from heaven or that resurrection of the dead appears in the Torah, which, by the way, it doesn't. We can break all those religious rules and still feel part of the Jewish people. We are a world people, as we'll explore through today's and tomorrow's sessions, with a pluralistic culture and civilization all its own. It's more than theological commitment. It has many languages and literature and historical memories and values. We have a moral responsibility to welcome people who identify with us and the authority to define who is a Jew, or for that matter, what is a Jew, belongs to all the Jewish people. And so our resolution stated that for us, a Jew is a person of Jewish descent or any person who declares himself or herself to be a Jew and identifies with these values and history and so on of the Jewish people, both past and future. So this is how we resolved that question. We decided that being Jewishness is a family identity, and people who choose to join the family by self-identification should be welcome as members of that family if they do it sincerely. And so that's our answer to what is a Jew. It's being part of a family. But as you can see, there are all these layers of past versions of how to do it that have influenced how we are, who we are, and what we do. So at this point, we'll stop before we move on to talking about the Jews of Alexandria, so I can take a drink, but also see if there's any comments or questions that have come up in the chat.
So no questions, but earlier we had a comment from John who says, this goes back to Alexandria. From my reading, the Greeks objected to Jews who wanted to be part of the Greek community, yet wanted to maintain their Jewish identities.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit because they weren't even necessarily opposed to Jews staying Jewish as long as it didn't interfere with public affairs. But the way it interfered with public affairs was that part of your duty as a citizen of a Greek city-state was to offer sacrifices to the Greek god of the city. Well, Jews didn't want to do that. But that means they're bad citizens because they don't care about the welfare of the city. If you really cared about the welfare of the city, you would do your civic duty and you would pray to the god for the good of the city. And so Jews were thought to be bad citizens because they didn't do that. And in some circles, they were also thought to be atheists because they didn't have any statues of their gods. And everyone knows that gods have statues, so you can know what they look like. Jews didn't have one, so maybe they were atheists. Ironically, they were believing in a god without a form in their own way. But for the ancient world, it was thought to, and they were also, by the way, thought to be lazy because they stopped working out of every 7 days. Like, okay, once a month, fine, but taking 1 out of every 7 days off, that was ridiculous. So there were a lot of culture clashes between Jews and Hellenists, which we'll talk more about in our second half. But I hope you get a flavor out of this, that Jewish identity has evolved over time. And part of what we're going to be exploring today is the directions that evolution has taken. And we can learn a bit about ourselves by looking at evolution. And that's true in a biological sense as well. One of my favorite pieces of art ever was made some 40,000 years ago. It's among the cave paintings they found in Lascaux in France, but in a number of other places as well, where they've painted bullocks and animals and hunts and so on. But my favorite piece of art was when some artist put their hand on a wall and put some paint in a tube and blew the paint and made a handprint on the wall. It's like saying, I was here. Some speculate, actually, as they've studied that handprint, that it might have been a woman who did that because of the shape of the fingers and the wrists and so on. I don't know how they can know that, but that's not my field. But what I love about that piece of art is it's saying even 40,000 years ago, at what we would call an early stage of our human cultural evolution, there was a desire to leave one's mark and to leave a personal mark behind. And that handprint belonged to somebody. We don't know who, but it gives us a sense of continuity because we have the same kind of hand that we can make the same kind of mark on the same kind of wall.